Nice. We have a nice music to get started. So it's going to be the more regulatory talk of the afternoon, I think, in the middle of a lot of community and technical talk. So I hope it's interesting to you. So my name is Xavier Lavayssie, indeed. Yes. A little bit about me, just so you know from where I come from. So I've been in the Ethereum ecosystem for quite a long time. For instance, we created a co-working space in Lisbon that's called The Block, and I encourage you to visit if you go to Lisbon. I created a game to introduce people to DeFi, which took me like some long nights during the COVID pandemic, so it was fun to do. But mostly what I do is I work as a consultant, a researcher for the public sector, trying to understand the space. So at the beginning it was explaining the blockchain, how that works, and slowly we are moving to, and that was the CBDC topic, and I think the main topic at the moment is tokenization, so how financial asset can be put on the blockchain. So that's what I'm working on, and that's why we have this presentation. I will try to keep a few minutes at the end if you have some questions, so yeah, it's good if you think about them before. A few trends, so why are we talking about tokenization? You know, stablecoin have been getting a lot of interest. I think it's clearly the first tokenized asset we have on the blockchain, a bit unregulated at the beginning, but a bit more clear now. There is two trends I distinguish. One is what I call real-world assets. So real-world asset is mostly what happens from the Web3 community of creating startup that tokenize assets, not asking permission, sort of, like in the typical Web3 or even startup way. So we have the stablecoin, treasuries, corporate bond, and slowly a lot of companies have issued these kind of assets. It's not huge, the volume, and especially compared to stablecoin, it's quite minimal still. But it's taking off slowly, and it's interesting because it matched some need of the crypto ecosystem to diversify risk. If you don't want to be only correlated to whatever happened in DeFi, you can have a different way of managing your yield. We have also like big DAOs that have a lot of treasuries, and they need to put that liquidity somewhere, and sometimes they want to use a different type of assets. So the other face of these is what I call tokenized financial instruments. It's the same thing, but it's just like a different aspect. And it's mostly the bank, the financial institution that are trying to have assets on a blockchain. There have been many, many experiments. In Europe, there has been, last year, the European Central Bank opened a call for making experiment with them, and they have tried all different options. One was on the blockchain, and two were using existing systems of the central bank, but just having a connection to some sort of API to connect with the cash part, which is often the problem. The main problem they have at the moment is all these experiments are well, but like they have no liquidity. Like every issuance is its own universe in the sense, and there is no platform to exchange them broadly, so they need to coordinate, choose the same platform, same standard, and that's the big challenge. Also, the regulators and central bank are not living that, and they are actively working. There have been, especially in Europe, two failures that we had in the past decade that we still need to work on. One was called the Capital Market Union, so we were trying to make one union, one market for the capital markets at the scale of Europe to facilitate the funding of SMEs and all of that. Didn't work. We still have a really fragmented ecosystem, and that's really important compared to the US, and that has been a report by Mario Draghi a few months ago showing that we don't have the right funding for startups in Europe. And open banking also, the hope of open banking was to create an ecosystem with different startups competing and using the APIs of the bank. Didn't work. The bank made all they could to have the most crappy APIs, so no one could build on top of it. Some used it, like Stripe, some intermediaries in the end used these APIs, but it hasn't been a frank success. When we see that in other countries, we have particularly PIX in Brazil, and UPI in India has been a huge success. So that's where we are. Like we haven't managed to create these European systems. So that's why there is a lot of experiments trying to use the blockchain to create new sort of payment mechanism and using also all of this. So what we are talking about, tokenization. I think you all have some sort of knowledge of this. Just one thing I will skim through, but I think that we shouldn't focus only on the blockchain aspects, but more on the properties. Like what's really interesting in the tokenization? It's not because it's on the blockchain. And to me, two properties I like is the fact that it's a shared system, so everyone is interacting with the same system and so can share the same view on the state and can interact and have trade with other people, because that's kind of clearing the topic of like permission blockchain, right? If you have your private blockchain on your side, yes, you have tokenized by using a blockchain, but if it's not connected to the rest of the world, I don't think you have achieved any benefit of tokenization. So shared and trust minimize, and I think in this room I won't need to explain it, but often this is the part I have to explain for hours of like why there are some benefits of minimizing trust, you lower the cost of starting things and so on. So yes, most of the time we think about Ethereum smart contracts and ERC20, but there are many other options, so it shouldn't be the only way of thinking about that. There are tokenized assets that use UTXO on Bitcoin. There are many options to do that. So yeah. Something that's important for our talk today is the fact that tokenization is not only a technology. So there is a technology part in blue, but there is also a legal aspect. And also it's not about just putting on the blockchain and you're done. You have a full life cycle of the assets to manage. So you have to prepare your asset, you have to distribute it, and find the people that buy it. So it's a big challenge once you have tokenized, like who's gonna buy and then interact with it. You have a lot of operation during the life of the assets. And for people that have tokenized assets, I realize that it's quite a challenge, because during the life cycle of like a bond, you have different events that happen, and you need different actors to interact and different action to happen. And then the end of the asset also, like, so what happens? Like you destroy the token, but like you need to unwrap all the legal aspect also. Another problem is the standards. I already mentioned it a little bit, like we need to align different actors on the same standard. So there is a pile of standards that are opening. There is some sort of competition that's happening among different actors to try to be the one proposing the standard that's going to be used for tokenized asset, but at the moment it's a bit detrimental because not everyone uses the same. Most are kind of ERC20 compatible, but it's not enough. Like the fact that you have the basic function is not enough to then build the infrastructure that interacts with all the aspects. And standard is not only the token standard, it's also a lot of other standards, like how you identify the assets. So you need some sort of identification number, so some agencies are working on that. How you have the same legal term, because if the assets, even if they look similar, but they are two different types of funds, they are not really easily fungible, so it's a lot of things that needs to be aligned. And the last thing about tokenized asset that's important in the context is to see that there are different options between the type of network, the type of assets, that we can expect that tokenized asset will be built on private blockchain initially, but I think more and more what we are seeing is that all the options are on the table, and I can tell you that I've been working with banks, central banks for a long time. They didn't want to hear about public blockchain a few years ago. I think now everyone is, okay, how we do it? So it's not done yet. Probably we need years before we will see more things happening, but there are already some banks that issue things on the public blockchain, and many others are considering how to do it. So, yes. But the main point of the talk is a paper I just wrote, and which I need to finish tomorrow to read, but to review. But the paper is just to simplify different type of tokenization, because when we talk about tokenizing an asset, there is often a confusion that comes if we talk about first tokenizing the assets and putting directly on the blockchain, or creating some sort of infrastructure, legal structure between the two. So when we have an asset, so in blue, that's it's token, sorry, that's on the platform, so that's the technical part. We have on one side the ownership, so how you relate the ownership of the token. I won't talk about that today, but it's also a question, because for the crypto asset, we are used to own the keys, and you control the asset, and you have it or you own it. For financial asset, it will never work like this. So you will have custody. For some asset, you need to have your name that's registered somewhere. So how we manage this part of the equation is one problem. But the part I will focus is the other part. Like you have a token, nice, but like what do you own on the other side of the equation? So how there is a link between the token that you control somehow or through your custodian and the asset. So this is where I distinguish direct tokenization, or also like native assets, where the asset is directly on the blockchain. So it's really simple. I think that for most of you, this distinction is quite clear. But I've seen that there are different choices of projects. So direct tokenization is you directly issue an asset on chain. For instance, you can already do that in France for unlisted shares of companies, shares of unlisted companies, anyway, where you are small SMEs, you can create put your shares on the blockchain. You can do that for bonds also, corporate bonds. It's quite easy to do. But for most assets, we need regulatory change. For cash on chain, you cannot do it at the moment. For treasuries on chain, you will need to have the treasury issuing directly on chain. And for a lot of different financial instruments, at the moment there is a specific register they need to be on, so they cannot be on chain at the moment. So what the ecosystem has come up with is a solution of indirect tokenization. So you create a legal structure, the legal structure on the assets, and then the token is a share of this legal structure. So for instance, for real estate, we have a company that does that in the US. They create a series of companies. Each company owns the real estate. So it's like a building in Chicago. The building is owned by this one company, and then the share of the company are on chain. So then when you buy a token, what you buy is a share of the company that owns the real estate. There are problems with that. So the great thing is like it allows you to tokenize everything, because as long as you can create a SPV of a fund, and this fund can have that share as a token, and many legislation allow for it, and especially in Switzerland is one of the most advanced for this. You can then have anything on chain, but you have this intermediary structure. If you do it well, like if it's a regulated fund, for instance, it's quite super secure. Like there is a lot of rules on how you manage the asset, and you guarantee that when you own the token and a share of the fund, you own the financial asset. When it's a company, for instance, it's really more shady. Like if anything happened, there is some sort of liability that, because the building, I don't know, like for some legal reason, you get to have to pay a fine on the building, then you don't really own anymore the same value of the asset, and quickly you can your token can have absolutely no value. So that's the problem. So yeah, we have many examples of how it's done in a robust manner through funds. So this is Anemoy, which is used by Centrifuge. So they created a sort of spin-off company that creates the funds that then they can tokenize. Most of them are using a lot of traditional financial companies as partners. So it's not totally made outside of the financial world. It's using different partners to custody the funds. So here we are talking about the underlying funds, and then other partners to facilitate the on-ramp. Most of the time they cannot directly use USDC, for instance, a stablecoin, and exchange it to the token. They need to convert it to cash, to then put the cash in the reserve, and then have the issuing the token. So it's a bit hassle at the moment, but it kind of works. And then the final case is what I call incomplete tokenization, and it's many cases where when you own the token, you own just something that's a bit symbolic, and there are many cases of this. One example was the HSBC gold token, totally like a PR stunt. So there is gold that's stored in the UK, and then they have created a certificate on the gold that you can buy through the Hong Kong branch. And then they have created a token on the certificates that you can exchange, but having the token has absolutely no correlation to the certificate. What matters is your relationship, your commercial relationship with the bank, and the fact that you bought the certificates on the gold in the end. There is no way for you to get the gold in the end. It's just like a certificate that has the value of the gold that's sourced somewhere. So yeah, it doesn't mean that it's totally risky or something. Like it kind of, it works legally, but it's not really a tokenization. There is other example of token created just to keep track of something. So that's really common already in the financial system, where you have the real asset somewhere, and then you have a representation of it to facilitate operation and for you to keep track. Yes, so that's the conclusion of my paper. So that's why I use a font that looks more serious to make it more serious conclusion. So distinguishing incomplete tokenization, which I mentioned, where it's just a mirror account, and complete tokenization, which can be direct or indirect. And as I was saying, like direct, at the moment you can already tokenize bonds, especially corporate bonds. I'm talking generally, right? So depending on the jurisdiction, there are differences. And for real estate, it's mostly indirect, or it can only be indirect at the moment. So thank you. Thank you for listening with a lot of attention, I've seen. And we have a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Yes, we have time for questions, around 5 minutes. Who would like to go first?
Thank you so much for the speech, really interesting. I'm wondering if it's technically possible to, for example, put in a ERC20 a basket of assets, of real-world assets. That ERC20, in which, like, legally speaking, what is it? Like an ERC20 filled with, as a basket of assets, like an ETF filled with real-world asset.
Yeah, you can, but so but you have two operations. One is create the basket of assets, and the other one is the ERC20. One example of that, I know in France, a company I really like, it's called Spico. So they have created a money market fund. So the money market fund is a legal structure that owns a basket of assets. What they own is a lot of really liquid assets, so treasury from the US, and sometimes a bit of cash and a couple of things like that. And then they just created an ERC20 that corresponds to that fund, and that's it. One interesting thing is they chose an ERC20 to make it simpler, but the ERC20 is just a list of functions that they need to have. What they have added is a function to revert, to destroy assets for them to control. So it's not fully like the typical decentralized ERC20, because they need to keep some. So they simplify the compliance by having just an ERC20, but keeping the final control on the assets.
What about since there will be like this huge trend of tokenizing assets, so there will be like assets availability already tokenized on chain, and like for example, if I want to build an ERC20 that directly take these ERC20s that are actually already tokenized and put them in my ERC20 that is a basket of assets, legally speaking, am I doing something like that needs to be regulated?
It's a good question. I would say, generally in Europe at the moment, everything that's DeFi is considered a bit under the radar. So if you create in a totally trust minimized manner, you lock the different ERC20 that exist that are a tokenized asset, and you create just a new version of tokenized asset, I'm not sure you would be having too much trouble, but I'm sure you should check thoroughly before launching these kind of things. But to me, that's where it will become interesting. It's like tokenizing one by one asset, having a slightly better way of settling things. It's nice, but what really becoming interesting is the moment we will be able to compose, and then it's also use it in different lending protocol and so on. And so, yeah, obviously it's the next step. But yeah, my intuition is that legally it should be a bit fine under the radar at the moment, but obviously at some point you are some sort of a fund, and there will be some question on how you have some liabilities on this. But
thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question.
A big one.
Could you touch on transferability?
Hmm?
Could you touch on transferability of tokens? So in the examples you've given, were there tokens that are not freely transferable because of legal constraints?
I'm not sure I understood fully, but
transferability means that I can send a token to some address that is not necessarily KYC'd.
Yeah.
So in traditional world, you cannot do that because most financial instruments are not bearer instruments, but tokens are bearer instruments.
So first, they are not fully bearer instruments. So it's like the way the blockchain works, and we use it most of the time, is as bearer instrument. But once you do a tokenized asset, you can have a lot of controls that allows it to not be a fully bearer instrument. As I said, like you can have a register off-chain that says the name of each person. Every time there is a transfer, you also update your off-chain record. And so it's not bearer, you know exactly the person. And if something goes wrong, you can have a revert function that allows you to do the thing. But this is a really interesting question, and actually it's the next project I'm going to be working on, is this question of standard, because there are different approaches that have been taken by different projects. Some embed the compliance directly on chain. So you have like a whitelisting mechanism, and you can only send it to people that have been whitelisted. And it's easier than to compose. It works better in the more DeFi way of doing things. Some have the compliance off-chain, so when you do transfer, there is some sort of function you need to call, and someone with an API is going to check if everything is compliant and then allow the process. And some have a more lean approach, I would say, to let you do everything, but then they check ex post, and they always have the control to do something. So it's definitely one of the key questions at the moment, because you cannot just transfer the way crypto works at the moment. You need to adapt indeed the process, and the way we design this has consequences on how much we can do later on, right? So for a simple transfer, it won't change anything. At some point, there will be some check by someone to make it work, but if it's ex post, ex ante, and so on, will make the difference in how much we can leverage all this to build more complex applications.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Xavier.
Sure.
Big
Thank you
round
for
of
listening.
applause to him.